Hello, my name is Olurotimiosha. Today is July the 1st, 2026. It's one day after uh, the, uh, the damp squib of court case, that's Trump versus Barbara, which ended up just upholding in birthright citizenship, but narrowly, 5-4. Uh, 6 years ago, I wrote an article when uh, Justice, she was then Judge Amy Coney Barrett when she was um, facing her confirmation hearings, and I predicted that one, of course, uh, she was going to be nominated, right? She was going to become, the next Associate Justice, because we had a Republican-dominated Senate. But I also predicted that even though she was a conservative, that she would, uh, you know, if she would possibly end up making some progressive decisions. She would end up voting on the progressive side in racial matters of racial justice. And she proved me out yesterday when she voted on the side of the progressive camp of the of SCOTUS. That's the Supreme Court of the United States. So if Justice Amy Coney Barrett had decided to vote with the conservatives, birthright citizenship would have ended yesterday. And it can happen. It's done. It's happened before. We've had Supreme Court justices who've gone against what the Constitution says. That happened in 1896 in Plessy versus Ferguson, right? Separate but equal was anti-canonical. It was against the 14th Amendment, and that led to Jim Crow, right? And the mass disenfranchisement of blacks in the South until, of course, Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which overturned that. So we narrowly averted that yesterday. But the reporting was briefly disrupted. I noticed it. It was disrupted yesterday due to a misreporting, a full reporting of the retirement of Justice Samuel Alito. This came around 10:51 a.m. by NPR, one of America's most preeminent reporting networks, media companies, NPR. And the culprits was a veteran journalist, Nina Totenberg, right? Nina Totenberg. And she said, so NPR published that Samuel Alito was retiring. It was a pre-write that they already had. I'm not going to get into the weeds, but it was a false reporting. Samuel Alito is not retiring. But in any event, Nina Totenberg had said that she misheard Chief Justice John Roberts in the hallway talking about announcing retirement, right? You know, that a retirement announcement, the phrase retirement announcements, and she said she misheard the word announcements, didn't hear the S. She said she didn't quite hear the S, so she heard retirement announcement, and so it had led her to jump to the conclusion that Samuel Alito was retiring. I don't know how all the logical calculation was made, the analysis, but basically there was actually no analysis, right? So she said she jumped to the conclusion that she heard announcement instead of announcements, and so she reported to her executive editor, and it was published. But when they realized that other major outlets, New York Times, Washington Post, nobody else was reporting it, they quickly pulled it. So it was just in the air, went live for just about 5 minutes. But of course, she apologized and called. She wrote a letter and apologized, a message, and apologized to Justice Samuel Alito, and she went on air, and NPR apologized. But what I found, bizarre though, was of all the explanations that were given in the media, nobody alluded to the age of Nina Totenberg. When they talked about her being, that she'd been a veteran since 1975, a veteran who reported on Supreme Court cases since 1975. And I thought, 1975, that's over 50 years ago. And I went to look her up and checked her bio. And so, she's about 82 years old. And I thought that Washington, D.C. simply does not do law of diminishing returns. They probably, for a nation that talks so much about being capitalist, nobody pays attention to what Adam Smith actually says. There's something in classical economics, as propounded by Adam Smith, called law of diminishing returns, right? You will climb and then you reach your peak, and at your peak you precipitously start declining. And I wondered, at what age do journalists in Washington start experiencing diminishing returns, right? So an 82-year-old journalist is not expected to reach diminishing returns. Like, she misheard something, and I don't want to be ageist, by the way. I don't want to be disrespectful to Totenberg or any elderly person working. But impairment in hearing, one of the impairments, hearing impairment, right, is one of the challenges that comes with aging, right, with being over a certain age. Again, I'm not trying to be mean, but I'm cognizant of a recent reporting discussion raised by former White House Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel and former Mayor of Chicago Rahm Emanuel, who's 66 years old, and he earlier this year, January 2026, and I watched his his interview in which he was discussing the need for legislation that places a mandatory retirement cap amongst senior federal officials in all branches of government, all three branches of government, at 75 years old. Instituting a mandatory 75 years old year retirement age. He called Washington, D.C. a gerontocracy, right? A gerontocracy that's ruled by the elderly, right? And I've written an article on this regarding Nigeria, because in Nigeria, I grew up in, under, if it wasn't a military dictatorship, it was a rule by gerontocracy, right? So the military dictators were replaced by civilian geriatrics, to put it mildly. I'm not, again, I come from a culture that we're very respectful of the elderly, but unfortunately, the youth's respect for the elderly has been abused by the elderly, who sort of are more self-interested than considering the interests of the nation, right? We have to remember, as we approach, our, the 250th anniversary of America's independence, our founding fathers retired. They didn't just sit there, and even though they took office at young ages, right, they were young people. Our founding fathers were leaders at a young age, in their prime. They didn't hold on to power forever, and these people didn't have pensions. The only person who went back to Congress and worked until his death in his 80s, that was John Quincy Adams, our sixth president. And that's because he didn't have a pension. Our founding fathers, the early presidents, the first 10, most of them became almost bankrupt, died in nearly impoverished, right? Thomas Jefferson, who had been a very wealthy man, the U.S. Congress had to buy his library, right? He had the largest library collection in North America, like about 6,500 volumes. So, but things are considerably different. Today, our federal employees, our senior federal employees, are virtually all millionaires. They're amongst the richest people. That's why Marylanders, right, are amongst the richest, is one of the richest states in America because of the federal workforce that lives in Maryland. And we have to be mindful of the youth, right? Employment amongst the youth, the young population. Amongst recent college graduates, they face a staggering unemployment rate of 9.4%, while the national average unemployment for overall national average for unemployment is around 4.3%. That's because most of the jobs, right, the elderly are far more employed than the youth. And that's in the federal government, not in the private sector. Underemployment, even amongst the employed graduates, right? There's a over 41% underemployment rate, meaning they're doing jobs that they're vastly overqualified for. 41% of university graduates. Mind you, they're carrying huge student debt. Student debts in many in the scores of thousands, as over 20s of thousands, scores of thousands, many, not a few, in over hundreds of thousands. Those who go to grad school, like medical school or go to law school, right, to be able to earn more, and to be able to, not really to earn more, but to follow their passion. We need doctors, we need lawyers, but it's very expensive, right? To go to law school costs over $300,000, right? In America, law school, just the 3 years of law school. That's not to talk about the debt that was incurred in doing undergrad, right? So many people graduate, people who have law degrees, medical degrees, they have about $500,000 in school debts, but they are guaranteed. The reason they go is because the government, recruiters come to talk to them, especially federal government workers. The federal government writes off your debt if you give them a certain number of years. They write, because you get the student loans from the federal government. So the federal government needs the most highly skilled people, right? And so the federal government says, that if you give us a certain number of years, we'll write off your debt. But the thing is, many people can't get into the federal government because there's an elderly class that's sitting in the federal government, right? Particularly Washington, D.C., that refuses to retire, even though their skills have significantly diminished, right? In the federal government, the retirement age in 1983 used to be 55 years old. In 1983, if you worked in the federal civil service, you had to retire by at the age of 55. That was in 1983. Today, the retirement age was removed. Now, 42% of people working in the federal civil service are over 50 years old. 42% of them. Compared to the private sector, just 33% of people over 50 are in the private sector, just 33%. In the federal civil service, people over in their 60s, right? People over federal civil servants in their 60s, right? Over 60 years old, comprise 15% of the federal civil service workforce. 15% and people in the 20s that are in the federal civil service are just about 7%, 7.8%. So the people in their 60s, the elderly in the federal civil service, outnumber young people, recent college graduates that we need. We need a replenishable pipeline, young workers, the most highly skilled, right, in their 20s, to keep coming and replenishing the workforce. But the elderly 60s who should have retired, they would have passed retirement age if we used the 1983 retirement age number of 55. They're 50%, and they outnumber those who we should be recruiting in the federal civil service in their 20s by a ratio of 2 to 1. because people in their 20s in the federal civil service workforce that are college graduates, or maybe not college graduates, but people in their 20s are only 7.8% of the federal civil service workforce, while people in their 60s are 15%. You know, the numbers are atrocious, and I think I'd like to talk more about this. And we'll look at the numbers, even in Congress, right? In Congress, it's a problem as well. In Congress, over 50 people in the Senate, right? The Senate is made up of 100 senators. Over 50 of them are over the age of 65 years old. Over 20% of the US Congress is over 70 years old. 3% of them are in their 80s. Of course, that includes Nancy Pelosi. She did a great job, but at some point, you should be able to retire. Look, I'm not bashing the elderly. This isn't ageism. But the reality is, if the gerontocracy or the geriatrics or the elderly people so old, right, that have passed retirement age or reached retirement age, if they're not a kakistocracy, that means the least qualified or the most incompetent, then they're certainly the richest, right? They're certainly the richest in the workforce, right? People in the retirement age, these people in their 70s, in their 60s, in their 80s, they're the richest because they've been working for so long. When they graduated, right, in the 60s, like Nina Totenberg, she was born around 1944. In the 60s, when she would have been in college, tuition was roughly between $50 a year to $1,000 annually. So she could graduate with zero debt, right? $50 a year to $1,000. In the 1960s, that was tuition. You can't get that these days, right? Schools I went to, GW, I know there are other schools, but GW tuition, just tuition alone is almost about $80,000 a year. I also graduated from Columbia University. Just tuition, when I was there, it was about $70,000 a year. I think it's about $80,000 to $90,000 a year. So we're talking about the 4 years undergrad, just tuition. I'm not talking about cost of living. Okay, we're talking about if you go to school, it will cost you over $400,000 in certain schools, private schools, but they provide the best opportunities, right? People who go to Columbia, who go to George Washington University, I know the doors that they've opened to me, right? They provide a lot of opportunities compared to cost of tuition during Nina Totenberg's schooling years, $50 a year, max $1,000 for a very expensive school a year, right? By the way, Nina Totenberg doesn't have a college degree. She dropped out of Boston University, right? She doesn't have a college degree. So all this while, she's been making money, piling up money, and that's good. So she should be rich. So these people have money saved up. The elderly have an opportunity to leave because they've passed their prime. Give other people, the younger people, a chance, the opportunity they had to build their careers and start businesses. This is America. We're supposed to have an entrepreneurial spirit, right? Our founding fathers were business people. They're people who came from the private sector. They had practiced in the private sector. They went in and out. Government service was usually service. They were trying to build their nation. It wasn't supposed to be the source of their main income, their main source of income, of their livelihood. They were just giving back to the nation. Many of them became broke serving in Congress. The richest man in America in 1775 was Robert Morris. He went to serve in the Senate. He served as United States Superintendent of Finance. All of these things made him broke. George Washington was one of the richest men in America. He became broke as a result of working as President of the United States. Most of them became broke as a result. Several times, Alexander Hamilton, when he left as Secretary of the Treasury, he said it was to provide for his family. He went back into private legal practice, right? He was a lawyer, one of America's most brilliant lawyers. So he went back to try and make money to support his family, his growing family. He had a large family because Government service was making them broke, but not these days, right? People, government workers make a lot of money again, so they haven't they've built a huge nest egg, and they can use that money and go back and start businesses. That's what America is about, because they have capital. They have great credit. People will give them credit, will give them loans. Banks will give them loans. Investors will invest in whatever businesses that they start. And they can employ younger people. They can employ young graduates who need work. And they can mentor them. They can teach them, they can write books. They can start new careers. But they need to leave the government, leave these industries to allow the young people in their primes to be able to flourish, right? It's painful when I see LinkedIn, the number of journalists who've graduated from prestigious universities, because that's what they tell you, that if you go to these prestigious schools, all schools are very expensive today, right? So you try and get into the best that'll provide you opportunities. They're freelancing, looking for work, they're underemployed, they're in their 30s, young people, 40s, right? They're underemployed, carrying massive debts. They're moonlighting in all sorts of jobs, right? But we have an elderly population that's been on the job for 15 years, and we know they're not really working. I'm going to continue and just think thoroughly about this and analyze the hazards, the hazards to our economy and to our democracy when we have a gerontocracy that constitutes really a kakistocracy. If they're not a kakistocracy, like I said, they have these networks, social capital they've built from decades in the federal workforce, in whatever, in employment, and they can translate this into consultancies. They can start new businesses. They can employ youth. They can do so many things, and they have the security, right? If they don't want to jeopardize their income, right? Risk their income. They're the ones who can fall back on social security. Young people can't get paid social security. They have the safety of social security if their businesses go bust in old age, right? So it's so unfair to young people when you consider the way the elderly class, the outsized status, how they constitute a chokehold to the pipeline of youthful talent, or even middle-aged people who can be operating in their prime. They're being prevented from flourishing in their professions and giving their best to the nation, right? Look, at 82, you've given your best to America or to whatever industry you're in, right? At 82, there's a book I'm reading, A Mathematician's Apology by G.H. Hardy. He was a mathematician, and said, look, in your 60s, you can't do anything anymore, right? You're not gonna create any new theorems as a mathematician. You're not gonna do anything new. You did all of that when you were young. The same thing in other professions as well. Let me read, and you know what is ironic? So Nina Totenberg, by the way, in her 80s, after over 50 years or 60 years of being a journalist, a Supreme Court, a journalist, she says that, look, this was a rookie's mistake, or whatever, rookie's error. The fact is, if a rookie, a young person, a new intern, a new college graduate had made the mistake that she had made, they would have been fired. So they have these outsized status. The NPR said that, the editor said, well, they published the error, the mistake, without confirmation because of the status, the outsized status that Nina Totenberg, after over 50 years of being a journalist, had. So it just diminishes the level of research and analysis. It's atrocious. Let me just read more of the statistics. I actually just reeled it off from my head. I actually knew it all already. Well, yes, I've actually said, so I had written down the data, the statistics from my research. Apparently, I'd everything was still in my mind, and in my discussion I was already just spilling them all out, the numbers, right? So fortunately for me, my memory still works. I try and exercise it, but hey, this is not supposed to bash Nina Totenberg or elderly people in the workforce. And talking about respect, as I was researching Nina Totenberg, when she was young, she was fired for plagiarism, right? And then she got another job. And when she was fired for plagiarism, she said it was, the real reason that her boss fired her was because he had been hitting on her, and she'd rebuffed his sexual advances. I don't know, sexual harassment is terrible. But she now got a job at another place, and she now published a celebrated article titled "The 10 Dumbest People in Congress." That wasn't very nice, So I think if she's so blunt, and disrespectful, people have to be very blunt as well. Hey, what goes around comes around. What she did, the rookie's mistake, like people have commented, because I've gone to read what journalists are saying, and they're saying, look, if a rookie had made that mistake, they would have been fired. And she did write this off as a rookie's mistake after 50 years, over 60 years of being a Supreme Court reporter or whatever, but of course she doesn't get fired as a result. And there are many talented young people who've invested in the sort of education she never invested in that don't have jobs, right? Again, underemployment among college graduates who are highly skilled is at over 41% in America, right? And again, it's not even just in journalism or in the federal civil service, but consider even Congress, right? I remember Dianne Feinstein, and when people observed, I watched an interview and she basically went blank. The late Dianne Feinstein, may her soul rest in peace. But people were observing that she had issues with her health, and that her mental acuity had significantly diminished, and it was obvious. It was very, very observable. However, she died in office at the age of 90, right, as a senator. Most recently, Eleanor Norton Holmes, whom I enjoyed so much, very brilliant. I used to watch her on the McLaughlin group on TV. McLaughlin group, they were a group of reporters. John McLaughlin is deceased now. There was Eleanor Clift, who is in her 80s, about 85. She's younger. Eleanor Norton Holmes was a regular. She was on the panel. And Eleanor Norton Holmes, once in a while, and there was another thing she did as well. Sometimes she would appear. She wasn't a regular. Clarence Page, whom I've met. Clarence Page, I think he's younger, about 79. I met him. He was a very pleasant person. I met him in DC. You run into for me, reporters and people are sort of celebrities, right? So I met him. He was very pleasant. I met Mark Shields, right? Shields, he's late now. He was a very pleasant man when I was a banker. He was very polite to me. But Eleanor Holmes, I used to watch her on the panel, various panels, discussing. Very smart woman. She graduated from Yale Law School, but she's 89, and recently she was in the news. Apparently she was scammed. Someone who was supposed to be doing an HVAC thing, somebody scammed her of some money, over $4,000, and the police in their report said that she was showing early signs of dementia, right? That she was showing signs of dementia. And then there was a rebuttal, right, from her office saying, well, that the police are not qualified to make a medical diagnosis. The police do make those errors. I've talked about my situation in Montgomery County. They do that. But then again, like I said, Eleanor Norton Holmes is 89 years old. And there's so many other people. Nancy Pelosi, she's stopped being speaker. She's in her 80s as well, maybe 86 years old. And she's very wealthy. They have an opportunity to start a business and train people, train a young pipeline of politicians, of professionals, right, or employ people. And because they have wealth, the young people, millennials, are struggling. Um, Gen Z, they're struggling because of unemployment and underemployment, college debt. You know, the elderly should really have mercy on young people and give us a chance. Give young people, even Gen Xers, lots of millennials, they are underemployed, and that's because in the federal civil service workforce, 13.5% of them have reached retirement age. But anyway, I'm going to continue this discussion. It's 30 minutes. I didn't intend it to last this long, so I'm going to discuss it in future. But something needs to be done. My name is Olurotimi Osha. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.